Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something I think we can all relate to. Emotions.
Yeah, definitely relatable.
Yeah, emotions.
Mm.
Right. But this time we're keeping it simple.
Mm.
We're going to get into it all through one source, a blog post by Clara Voss about Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart.
Nice.
So have you ever felt like you just
Yeah.
you just don't have the right words for what you're feeling?
Oh, for sure. All the time.
You know what I mean? Well, that was Voss before she found this book, and we're going to see how Brown's insights really helped her out.
Yeah. I think what's so great about Voss's experience is that she starts out thinking like, okay, I've got this emotions thing down, happy, sad, angry, got it.
Right, the basics.
Right. But then reading Atlas of the Heart, it was like suddenly realizing there's this whole hidden world of emotions she'd never even known how to name before.
Yeah, it's like upgrading from using crayons to paint.
Yeah.
Suddenly you got all these colors, all these nuances to work with. And Voss even talks about how she used to mix up anger with other feelings. Like she'd get angry in situations that, looking back, were actually disappointments or frustrations.
hmm That lack of emotional granularity is something so many of us struggle with. I mean, it's like trying to navigate a city with only a vague sense of north, south, east, west. You'll kind of get around, but you'll miss all the details and you might take some wrong turns. Brown's argument is that a richer emotional vocabulary is just crucial, and not just for, being more aware of yourself, but also for communicating well and for building stronger relationships too.
It makes sense. If you can't even pinpoint what you're feeling, how are you supposed to express it?
Right. Exactly.
Voss actually calls it being lost in a wilderness without a map.
Ah, I love that.
Yeah, and it's true. Like, think about those times you just felt completely overwhelmed but couldn't really say why.
hmm
Or when, like, a conflict just blew up because neither person could actually express what the real issue was.
Yeah. And the cool thing is that Brown doesn't just hand us a list of emotion words to memorize. She actually digs into the subtleties and the nuances of each one. And Voss talks about this aha moment she had when she finally understood the difference between envy and jealousy.
Oh, yeah. I'll admit I mix those up sometimes, too.
Right. They sound similar, but they're actually totally different things. Envy is that longing we feel when we want what somebody else has. Like when you're scrolling through social media and you see those perfect vacation photos.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Right. But jealousy, that's more about fear of loss. It's what we feel when we think something we already have is threatened, like a relationship, a job, even a prized possession. Recognizing which one you're dealing with can be huge for understanding your own reactions.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just envy and jealousy. Voss also talks about finally grasping things like resentment, which Brown describes as anger, plus a sense of injustice and compassion fatigue, that feeling of being emotionally drained from taking care of others. Like, these were emotions that Voss had definitely experienced, but never had the words for.
Right. It's like finally getting a diagnosis for some weird health thing you've been struggling with for years. Suddenly it has a name and you can understand the causes and maybe even treat it. It's the same way with these more complex emotions. Naming them gives you a sense of control. You start to see them not as these big, scary, overwhelming things, but as experiences with, specific triggers and patterns that you can learn to manage.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. Voss starts off feeling lost emotionally. Then she finds this map in Brown's book, and suddenly she's able to navigate her inner world and her relationships in a whole new way.
Exactly. And one of the most profound shifts Voss experiences is in how she approaches empathy. Brown emphasizes the importance of holding space for other people's emotions, which basically means just being present and listening without judgment or trying to fix anything.
Okay. Holding space sounds kind of abstract. What does that actually look like in real life?
Well, think about it. Have you ever vented to someone about a problem and their immediate reaction was to offer advice?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Right. And it can feel like they're not really listening. They just want to jump in and fix things. Holding space is the opposite. It's about saying, hey, I hear you. I see your pain. It's okay to feel what you're feeling.
I like that.
Yeah. And Voss tells this story about her friend who was just drowning in work and feeling completely overwhelmed. And instead of saying, oh, you should delegate more or maybe just take a vacation, Voss just said, it sounds like you're feeling really undervalued right now.
Wow, and I bet that meant a lot to her friend.
It did. Her friend was just so relieved to be truly heard. you know? And it highlights how often we jump into fix-it mode instead of just listening with empathy. Sometimes the most supportive thing you can do is just validate someone's emotions and create a safe space for them to process what they're going through.
Okay, this is making me rethink how I respond in those situations.
Hmm.
But what about when it comes to our own emotions?
Yeah.
Voss is pretty open about struggling with self-criticism, which I think a lot of us can relate to.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where Brown's focus on self-compassion comes in. Voss describes how she used to just beat herself up when things went wrong, which just fueled this cycle of shame and self-doubt. But Alice of the Heart helped her reframe those experiences.
So instead of saying, I messed up again, I'm such a failure, she learned to be kinder to herself.
Exactly. Brown says we need to treat ourselves with the same compassion we'd offer a close friend. You know, if a friend came to you feeling overwhelmed and self-critical, you wouldn't pile on more judgment, would you?
No, of course not.
Right. You'd offer support and understanding. Self-compassion is about extending that same kindness to ourselves.
It's like that saying, you can be your own worst critic or your own best friend.
Yes. And Voss is this great example. She was facing a tight deadline and feeling super overwhelmed. And instead of spiraling into self-criticism, she paused and actually identified the emotions she was feeling, shame and overwhelm. And just naming them helped her approach the situation with more clarity and self-compassion.
So it's not about pretending those negative feelings don't exist. It's about acknowledging them without letting them dictate how we treat ourselves. And I'm guessing this ties into Brown's whole thing about vulnerability.
Absolutely. But before we jump into that, let's pause for a second and hear from you. What's resonating with you so far from Voss's journey with Atlas of the Heart? You know, it's fascinating how Voss's experience with Atlas of the Heart goes beyond just understanding her own emotions.
Right.
She develops this whole new skill set. Brown calls it emotional literacy. It's like she's learning a new language, one that lets her understand both her inner world and her relationships in a much clearer way.
It's like she's gone from, deciphering a few basic phrases to having full-blown conversations.
Right.
Yeah. And it's really impacting how she interacts with others, especially when it comes to empathy.
One thing Voss highlights is how Brown differentiates between empathy and sympathy. Sympathy is more about feeling sorry for someone,
Okay.
keeping a distance from their pain. But empathy, on the other hand, that's about stepping into their shoes, trying to understand their perspective and connect with them on an emotional level.
So it's not just about feeling bad for someone. It's about trying to see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And this shift in understanding really changes how Voss approaches her relationships. She talks about a time when a coworker was going through a tough divorce. And in the past, Voss might have just offered some generic words of comfort or tried to distract her coworker with, lighthearted conversation.
Right.
But this time she did something different. She just sat with her coworker, listened without judgment, and acknowledged the pain she was feeling.
That must have been hard.
It can be. It's much easier to try to fix things or brush those uncomfortable emotions under the rug.
Yeah, for sure.
But Brown argues that it's in those moments of vulnerability that real connection happens. By just being present with someone's pain without trying to change it or offer solutions, we create a safe space for them to, feel seen and heard.
And that's what Voss found, right?
Mm-hmm.
By just holding space for her coworkers' emotions, she actually gave her more support than any advice could have. It's a reminder that sometimes the best thing we can do is just listen with empathy.
Right, and this approach isn't limited to just personal relationships. Brown argues that empathy is crucial in all parts of our lives, from work to our communities, even our interactions with strangers. Imagine how different our world would be if we all just made a conscious effort to connect with others on a deeper, more empathetic level.
Okay, getting chills just thinking about that. But speaking of vulnerability, that seems to be a key theme in Voss's journey with Atlas of the Heart. And it's a topic that makes a lot of people uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think it's because we often misunderstand what vulnerability really means. It's not about oversharing or spilling your deepest secrets to just anyone. Brown defines it as the courage to show up as our authentic selves, even when it feels risky. It's about embracing imperfection, earning our stories, and allowing ourselves to be seen for who we truly are.
Warts and all.
Exactly. And this is where Voss's experience gets really interesting. She talks about how she used to be terrified of vulnerability. She would avoid difficult conversations, shy away from expressing her true feelings, and just try to present this perfect version of herself to the world.
Yeah, I think we all do that to some extent.
It's like we all have this inner critic telling us that we're not good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to be fully seen. But Brown challenges that narrative, you know? She
Uh,
says our imperfections are actually what make us human and relatable.
so it's about letting go of that need for perfection and embracing the messy, imperfect beauty of who we are.
Exactly. And Voss's journey with vulnerability takes this major turn when she has a conflict with a colleague. In the past, she would have just avoided the situation or tried to smooth things over, but this time she decides to have an honest conversation about what was bothering her.
I bet that was scary.
It was. But she approached the conversation with vulnerability and authenticity. Instead of blaming her colleague or getting defensive, she just expressed how his behavior was impacting her and asked for a more collaborative working relationship.
Wow. And how did he react?
He was actually incredibly receptive. It turned out he hadn't even realized how his actions were affecting her.
Hmm.
And that one conversation, fueled by Voss's willingness to be vulnerable, completely shifted their dynamic. They ended up having a much more positive working relationship.
Wow. So her vulnerability actually empowered her. She took a risk, expressed her needs, and ended up creating a better outcome for everyone.
Exactly. And this is what Brown emphasizes. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's actually a source of strength and connection. By letting down our guard and allowing ourselves to be seen, we create space for deeper, more authentic relationships.
I love how Voss's experience shows that vulnerability doesn't always have to be about these big dramatic moments. It can be as simple as expressing your true feelings to a friend, asking for help when you need it, or admitting that you don't have all the answers.
That's a great point. It's those small, everyday acts of courage that allow us to connect with others on a deeper level. And those small acts can have this ripple effect, creating a more compassionate and understanding world, one interaction at a time.
This is making me rethink my own relationship with vulnerability. I think I've often seen it as something to avoid, but Voss's story shows how powerful it can be when we embrace it.
And remember, vulnerability isn't something we just achieve overnight. It's a journey, a process of unlearning old patterns and embracing a new way of being in the world.
Right.
But like any journey, the most important step is taking that first step.
So we've seen how Voss started feeling emotionally lost, then found a map in Alice of the Heart, and then started to navigate her inner world and her relationships in this whole new way. But I'm curious, what's the bigger picture here? What's the ultimate takeaway from Voss's journey?
It feels like we've uncovered so much about Voss's experience with Atlas of the Heart.
Yeah, it's amazing how she went from feeling so lost to having this whole new way of understanding and dealing with her emotions.
What really stands out to me is how Voss's journey shows how interconnected all these ideas are. Emotional literacy, empathy, vulnerability, they all kind of build on each other.
Right. It's like they all work together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The better we understand our own emotions, the better we can empathize with others. And it's through vulnerability that we can really connect with people and build trust.
So it's like this positive feedback loop. Each skill makes the others even stronger.
Right.
Okay, but this brings us back to that bigger question. Why does all of this even matter? What's the benefit of getting better at understanding emotions?
Well, for a long time, intelligence was measured mostly by things like logic and problem solving.
Right, the more traditional idea of intelligence.
Exactly. But now we're starting to realize that emotional intelligence, what we call EQ, is just as important, maybe even more important for success and well-being.
So it's not just about being book smart, it's about being heart smart too.
Exactly. Studies have actually shown that people with high EQ tend to have better relationships. They're better leaders, and they're generally happier and more fulfilled.
And that seems to be what Voss is finding too. She talks about how learning about her emotions has not only improved her relationships, but it's also helped her feel more confident in every part of her life, like she's tapped into this inner source of strength.
That's exactly it. Emotional intelligence helps us show up as our best selves in everything we do. And this actually leads us to one of the most important takeaways from Atlas of the Heart: wholehearted living.
Okay, that sounds interesting. What does Brown mean by that?
It's about embracing all our emotions, even the negative ones, and living with courage, compassion, and connection. Letting go of that need to be perfect and just being our true authentic selves.
That sounds great, but also a little intimidating. How do we even start living that way?
Well, I think Voss gives us a pretty good guide. It starts with being curious about our own emotions and being willing to learn and grow. And the good news is that emotional intelligence is something we can develop over time.
It's like we're all on this lifelong journey exploring the world of our emotions.
And with each new discovery, we learn more about ourselves and the world around us.
I love that. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Atlas of the Heart,
hmm
what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want them to understand that emotional intelligence isn't a luxury. It's really important for navigating our complex world. And when we invest in our own emotional literacy, we're not just improving our own lives, but we're also making the world a better place.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And if you're feeling inspired to start your own journey of emotional discovery, I highly recommend checking out Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart. It's an amazing resource full of wisdom, insights, and practical tools to help you unlock your full emotional potential. Until next time, keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep embracing the power of your heart.